One of the most important things for me is that this kind of presentation is not only my own doing. It's kind of like it came out of conversations with different colleagues. We are working together towards this exhibition at the UC Berkeley Art Museum in 2022. And I would like to invoke or kind of like mention colleagues Grace Sambo, independent curator from Indonesia, Leigh Rayford, she's a scholar of Afro-American photography at the UC Berkeley, Lizzie Asafo Agredyi, she is the curator at the National Museum of Accra, Suman Gopinath, curator from Bangalore, Mustafa Shabir Hussain, a curator from the Singapore National Gallery, and the aforementioned Vera May. I also would like to invoke Nina Ugude, my partner, who is doing substantial research in the literature of Beb Vuik, a Dutch-Indonesian writer and activist, who is having an important role in this talk. And the talk kind of like seems to be, after what we heard today, rather a footnote to Oliver's talk and also a footnote to Vera May's talk. So the title, Pour me mettre à leur disposition, is maybe the bodily position I would adopt for this presentation after hearing Oliver about inhabiting or performing certain bodily positions where you go in and out. So pour me mettre à leur disposition comes from Jean Genet. It means so much as to put me at their service. Writing in Revolt as Significant Living with Richard Wright and Jean Genet. Here you see Jean Genet supporting the Black Panthers during a demonstration at Yale University, and Richard Wright with participants in the Konfrontasi Study Club in Tugu, Indonesia, 1955. The Spectre of Comparisons, Benedict Anderson's book tracing the disturbing doubling of complex histories, which in fact are separated by space and time, frames an at first sight odd compulsion of mine to draw parallels between African-American author Richard Wright and French novelist and playwright Jean Genet, when it comes to their reflections on colonialism and colorism. Both authors undertook specific but seminal travels that fundamentally informed their comparable yet different quest for a space in which asymmetric relationships are reimagined and reconfigured in new, possibly more egalitarian ways. Highly acclaimed for his 1940 novel, Native Son, and his 1945 memoir, Black Boy, and after fleeing America's continuing and intolerable racial discrimination in 1947 for Paris, Richard Wright became a charter member and contributor to Alioune Diop's Présence africaine, the then most important Pan-African journal in the world. In rapid succession, he met and befriended the Senegalese writer Léopold Sédar Senghor, the West Indian poet Aimé Césaire, and the Jamaican ex-Comintern member George Padmore. So here you see on the right, Richard Wright giving a lecture next to Alioune Diop, the founder of Présence africaine. And here are the characters, the figures, the important writers and politicians just mentioned before. In 1956, Wright participated in the Premier Congrès des écrivains et artistes noirs, organized by Présence africaine. An interesting kind of oddity is that the poster was not designed by a black artist, but by Pablo Picasso. From June to August 1953, the same year, Wright began a correspondence with French West Indian psychiatrist and political philosopher Frantz Fanon. He traveled to the Gold Coast, now Ghana, where he witnessed Kwame Nkrumah's Convention People's Party, West Africa's first mass socialist party, as it campaigned for independence from British rule. In 1954, Wright published a travelogue called Black Power, a record of reactions in a land of pathos. His subsequent The Color Curtain, a report on the Bandung Conference, is based on his impressions and analysis of the Asia-Africa Conference, the epoch-making gathering of representatives from 29 independent Asian and African countries held in the city of Bandung. Wright stays a couple of weeks in Indonesia, and next to attending the conference, he extensively meets the Indonesian intelligentsia. Later, in 1957, he re-evaluates both important journeys in his book White Men Listen, a gathering of essays in support of anti-colonial struggles in Asia, Africa, and the West Indies. So here you have the cover of the Color Curtain and White Man Listen. And Nav had a very nice first edition of the Color Curtain with him, which we maybe can look in later. On his turn, Jean Genet, after a prolific career as a novelist and playwright, and after a severe depression and a suicide attempt, he resurrected as a political activist in 1970. On February 25th of that year, his sustain is solicited by a responsible of the Black Panther Party, American organization fighting for the autodetermination of black people. Genet offers to campaign on site in the USA. Here you see him with Black Panther Elmer Howard at a rally in 1970 to support the imprisoned party leader Bobby Seale. And in the other photograph you see him with Angela Davis, who was in fact his translator because Genet didn't speak English, so he spoke in French at the rallies and was translated by, the speeches were translated by Angela Davis. From the 1st of March 1970, he stayed with the Black Panthers, sharing their lives, and in their company, he crisscrossed the American territory, giving countless conferences in universities or in front of the press, till May 1st, 1970, when he delivered his famous May Day speech at Yale. The day before, he was summoned from immigration services in Connecticut to show his identification papers and his visa. The day after the speech on May 2nd, Genet left the country by clandestinely crossing the Canadian border. The 20th of October of the same year, by intermediary of Black Panther Friends in France, feminist film director Carole Roussopoulos and her husband Paul, Genet is invited by Mahmoud El-Hamshari, the delegate of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Paris, to travel to Jordan. What is interesting here, it's connected to an international project. At the moment, there is the Defiant Muses show in the Reina Sofia in Madrid, which involves, next to Delphine Seyrig, an important actor and female feminist activist, the films of Carole Roussopoulos. Genet is going to stay half a year in Jordan and Palestine. After meeting Yasser Arafat at the Wahdati camp, he obtains a permit to visit the Fedayeen and the Palestinian bases for refugees. At the end of 3 more trips to the Middle East, he is arrested by the Jordan authorities and expelled from the country on November 23, 1972. Tellingly, Genet invokes Wright in one of his addresses at the Panthers gathering at MIT. And I quote, "I am with the Black Panthers like Richard Wright was already with me when I first got out of prison," end of quote. The tribute Genet paid to Wright must probably be taken symbolically, since the first French translation of a book by Richard Wright, The Children of Uncle Tom, dates from 1946, 2 years after the last out of Genet from prison. But it is argued that in this way, Genet draws authority from Wright and links himself to the racial power struggle in the US. Wright, on his turn, wrote the dust jacket blurb for Genet's provocative debut novel Notre-Dame des Fleurs, Our Lady of the Flowers. This one. And I quote, "Genet has taken a tabooed subject and created a world that is out of this world. He is a magician, an enchanter of the first order." End of quote. In 1951, it was Wright who convinced New Story magazine in the US that they accept to publish excerpts from Our Lady of the Flowers. And while in exile in France through the 1950s, Wright befriended Genet, and the latter modeled his play Les Nègres after Wright's Native Son. Native Son is the very famous story of 20-year-old Bigger Thomas, a black youth living in utter poverty in a poor area on Chicago's South Side in the 1930s. Clément Village, a character from Notre-Dame des Fleurs, from Genet, reappears in Les Nègres and echoes Bigger Thomas in the fact that they kill a white woman. It's a whole other story in which I don't want to delve right now, but Les Nègres is a kind of like a correction of Genet in terms of his own attitude in the black and white discussion, where he ostensibly commits himself to examining these type of relationships. And it's kind of like almost a redemption of his former, more, let's say, primitivist position. Richard Wright's apprehension of his own displacement from a racist and capitalist empire at home led him in the search of global affiliations and models for decolonizing the mind. The primary objective of the last third of Wright's life, namely the effort to demonstrate that the searing dialectic of racism and liberation struggles in the Jim Crow American South that had shaped him, had become, in his own words, the problem of freedom in the Western world, the problem of Africa and Asia. See what we have? This is still on the left. It's a stage adaptation of Native Son featuring Richard Wright himself as Bigger Thomas. And on the right, it's a scene of the first mise en scène of Les Nègres by Roger Blin in France, which was still overseen by Genet. But that's, sorry, I went too slow. Since its publication in 1956, The Color Curtain has been a prominent first-hand account of the Bandung Conference. As an African-American, Wright connects the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist resolutions of the conference with the national civil rights movement in the US, linking anti-racist struggles to what W.E.B. Du Bois called, in his prescient but often forgotten phrase, the problem of the world color line. Already in a 1947 interview, Wright, whose personal trajectory led him to a brief membership of and subsequent disillusionment with the Communist Party, similar to Aimé Césaire, declared that the African American is an intrinsically colonial subject, but one who lives not in China, India, or Africa, but next door to his conquerors, attending their schools, fighting their wars, and laboring in their factories. In his letter to American intellectuals, Genet iterates Wright about the complex reality of the African American as being colonized within the US. I quote, "The reality," and the English translation is mine. I didn't find the right in the English translation, so sorry for maybe messy, clumsy translation. "The reality of the black colony within the United States is a very complex one. Disseminated in the midst of an arrogant nation which claims to be master of the world, the blacks scattered amongst the white population, oppressed by racism, by the indifference of the whites, threatened by the oppressive police and the judiciary, were forced to develop a very new form of struggle in this unique situation. It was then that the Black Panther Party was formed, first to defend the rights of the black colonized within the USA, then to undertake an original political reflection." In the same text, Genet explains how he became a public intellectual supporting the Panther movement. And this I'm going to quote in French. "Lorsque le Black Panther s'est adressé à moi en France, je me suis tout de suite rendu aux États-Unis pour me mettre à leur disposition." End of quote. Though both authors consider the African American as a colonized subject living in the country of their oppressor, Genet's suggestion that the African American's fight is a very singular one, based on a unique situation in the world, due to being a people without claim to a land base and a people without a government except that which enslaved them. Contrasts, in fact, with Wright's confidence to find a commonality between African American experiences and decolonizing nations' understanding of colonialism and empire. Wright's Black Power is considered a pioneering instance of the subgenre Stephen Howe coined as, I quote, "travel literature by Black Americans telling of their experiences, sometimes deeply painful and disillusioning, of estrangement and incomprehension when exposed firsthand to modern Africa, of finding themselves seen by locals and indeed coming as never quite before to see themselves as first and foremost Americans." End of quote. According to Kodwo Eshun from the Otolith Group, Black Power is, I quote, "a text whose conceptual restlessness registers his, Wright's, existential alienation from the Gold Coast and challenged readers expecting a comforting ode to the consolations of racial belonging. Generations of intellectuals have journeyed from the United States to the new state of Ghana ever since, each of them compelled to confront the discomforting questions Wright asked for himself." These are two photographs Richard Wright made in Ghana. His original plan was to publish the Black Power book with many, many, many photographs, which the editors in the end reduced to a couple of photographs, and in subsequent editions, not anymore. Kodwo Eshun from the Otolith Group made an installation that's here, in which he tries to reconstruct the original idea of the Black Power book, using all the photographs that Richard Wright made and that are stored in the Beinecke Library at Yale in the US. So he kind of like tries to reconstruct the original idea in an audiovisual installation, of which we here have another installation view, and adds to it an espionage aspect. It's kind of like he locates it in a reflection on the Cold War times, and kind of like makes it an installation of people that are kind of like trying to illicitly see others and how, in fact, gazes are kind of like fleeing away. And so it's kind of like it's at the same time a reconstruction and a comment on the Black Power book. And this is a painting by the aforementioned John Biggers, American artist who is one of those intellectuals that traveled to Ghana, but in this case not a writer but a painter, and depicted the Kumasi market in Ghana. It's one of these kind of like iterations of many, many African Americans going to the so-called homeland, which was often also financed by Ghana. W.E.B. Du Bois finished his life in Ghana. The last 3 years of his life he lived there under the protection of Kwame Nkrumah when it became too complicated to stay in the US. In December 1954, Wright read the announcement of a conference in Bandung, Indonesia, poised to address international racialism and colonialism, and he decides to attend. As it was later revealed and debatedly unbeknownst to Wright at the time, the CIA had helped to fund his trip via the Paris office of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. All the while the US revoked the passport of certain black radicals, most notably Du Bois and Paul Robeson, to avoid that they would attend the conference. So though in self-imposed exile in Paris, it is argued that the US was still mingling with his affairs. Again, his belief to find a commonality between the African-American and decolonizing people's experiences would be tested by his observations at and around the conference. Though advertised differently, in the end the conference was focusing mostly on sovereignty struggles and nation building. Here you see Wright's press card, some of the impressions on the conference, photographs by Wright, and you see him there with Ethel Payne. It's a fragment from a film that is made by the Indonesian government film company. The film is called Konferensi Asia Afrika, and it's the only moment there is like a real document of Richard Wright present on the conference. Moreover, next to that disillusionment at the conference, although he tries to cover that up in the book, he's kind of like writing in a very enthusiastic mode, like if you remember the quote that Vera brought about. But he's very disappointed in kind of like what he would expect, that it was a conference really of the colored people. And it was much more like, in reality, except the performances there of the politicians, a conference in which nation states were discussing their sovereignty and their internal problems. Moreover, Wright was interpellated by his Indonesian hosts, members of the nationalist Konfrontasi journal. It's not the same Konfrontasi as Vera talked about. That was a political movement by Sukarno in the problems with Malaysia. This is a journal. It's also called Konfrontasi, and it was connected to the Indonesian Socialist Party. Its members, amongst others, Mokhtar Lubis, Sultan Takdir Ali Shibana, and Beb Fuik, claim to be the rightful heirs to world culture. From the outset, the authors say that Indonesia's national culture project is internationalist, Indonesia placing itself in the world. The declaration that they made oozes self-confidence about the place of Indonesian culture in the world, its artists and thinkers. Indeed, all Indonesians are legitimate heirs to world culture, not some bastard progeny who must fight for their rights. That self-proclaimed entitlement made the group vulnerable and de facto subordinate their aesthetic ideals to a Western internationalism. And it caused them later on in 1963 problems with President Sukarno, whose international politics evolved towards a more anti-Western stance. Here you see Richard Wright but we come to that, participating at the Konfrontasi Study Club in 1955 with Siti Nuraini, Sitor Situmorang, and other authors of the Konfrontasi group. Wright passed a weekend hosted by Mokhtar Lubis, and that's what we see here, in its villa in the town of Tugu. Famously, he stated there, and it's according to himself in the Color Current, but also to Beb Fuik, I quote, "I always feel immediately at home among colored people. Beb Vuijck reacted skeptically, as she was about to review critically the premise of Wright's Black Power and his headstrong desire to find connections between African Americans and Africans. Although Wright feels an emotional draw based on skin color, having special feelings for Africa, blood and ethnicity provide him with absolutely no connections to the Gold Coast, according to Vuijck, whose culture and spirit are foreign to him. The way Wright reacts, and I quote Vuijck, to these things in Africa is no different from the way a white American would react, end of quote, suggesting that Wright is wearing glasses that frame the way he sees things. Her use of the wearing glasses metaphor preempts the later criticism of Wright's Bandung account by Mokhtar Lubis for wearing colored glasses in Indonesia, having sought behind every attitude he met colored and racial feelings. Lubis and his fellow Confrontatie colleagues were astonished by the publication of The Color Curtain, as the Indonesian novelists and others belonging to the new generation, those who Wright met at the Confrontatie study club, were the least racial and color conscious of the various groups in Indonesia. This made Lubis, per Vuijck, cynically remark that the African-American author was color crazy. But maybe Indonesia's President Sukarno was more sensible to color than the Confrontatie authors. And in a politically strategic masterpiece, he recast the Bandung Conference as a theatrical performance, with what is being called afterwards the Merdeka Walk, the famous freedom walk made by the delegates to the Merdeka building along the Jalan Asia Afrika as the impromptu creation of a ritual that contributed to an iconic performative act during the conference. Sukarno, Nehru, Zhou Enlai, and Nasser, people we saw in the previous talk, all understood the importance as performers in their role as new international statesmen, representing the esprit de corps of the newly emergent post-colonial world, taking part in the collective inauguration ceremony of post-colonial Asia-Africa, a process of historical canonization. Genet writes a lot about the performative self-staging of the Panthers, the theatrical, the extravagant, and the emblematic as constituent of their success. It was a way of making visible and being perceived as self-determining. Perceived because there was no land. The American territory belonged to the whites. That's why the Panthers undertook subversive action in collective consciousness. As they are always on the territory of the masters, they will terrorize the master, mais avec les seuls moyens dont ils disposent, la parade. But with the only means they have, the parade. In that sense, it echoes the Freedom Walk. This is a quote from Un captif amoureux, the last book of Jean Genet, which is wrongly translated as a prisoner of love. It's rather a prisoner in love. And further he writes in there, the Panthers wanted this image, if you want, theatrical and dramatic. By provoking its representation in the press and on the screen, they wanted this image to hound whites, and by this threat they succeeded. The kind of like what Genet talks about a lot is the mise en scène, the kind of like typography, the graphic design, the emblematic as a very important element that is part of what he calls the success of the Panthers, even if they were in the end politically not successful. There is some artwork that is maybe important in this, also in preparation of our exhibition. Here we see Bukhra Khalili's The Radical Ally, which is a visual and textual investigation in Genet's time with the Panthers. There is also a video called 22 Hours, and it's a video in which she questions what remains of the political memory of the Panther Party through the voices of Kiana Pontes and Vanessa Silva, two young Bostonians committed to the heritage of struggle for equality for African Americans, and also the voice of Doc Miranda, the former captain of the Boston chapter of the Panther Party. Khalili interrogates the different layers of history that have engulfed the struggle for liberation to which the characters in her video have committed their lives. In the publication, The Radical Ally, by Khalili, she explores the position of the radical ally, kind of like what Genet is calling himself, as the reverse of another thing he called himself within French and European society, the declared enemy. To become the radical ally, Genet had to destroy the white man within him. For Richard Wright, words, to paraphrase Godwo Eshun, were void of symbolic content. Looking back at his own novel Native Son, Wright himself notes the following about the main character, and I quote, "The civilization which had given birth to Bigger Thomas contained no spiritual sustenance, had created no culture which could hold and claim his allegiance and faith, had sensitized him and had left him stranded, a free agent to roam the streets of our cities, a hot and whirling vortex of undisciplined and unchanneled impulses. The result of these observations made me feel more than ever estranged from the civilization in which I lived." A similar statement is, or a similar estrangement better, is sensed by Genet. "What people call civilization will disappear. It is already dead, because it is founded on contempt. For example, the contempt of the rich for the poor, the contempt of whites for blacks, and so on. Every civilization founded on contempt must necessarily disappear. And I'm not speaking of contempt in terms of morality, but in terms of function. I mean that contempt as an institution contains its own dissolving agent." End of quote. Wright, as Godwin suggests, sought to find a vocabulary for those who were born into the decivilizing void produced by the twin forces of colonization and slavery. Reviewing Black Power, Rebecca Voigt already noted, the slaves spoke in hundreds of different ethnic languages and belonged to different African cultures. To understand each other, they had to use the language of the overseer. End of quote. The impossibility to speak outside of the language of the colonizer, Genet locates in the fact that for an African American, history is cut short. I quote, "Il ne peut remonter dans son histoire au-delà des périodes d'esclavage." End of quote. They have to use the same language, the words, the syntax, the grammar of the enemy, though they feel the need of a separated language that would belong to their nation. The hatred for the white man can only be expressed in the language that belongs to both the white and the black, but over which the white man holds the grammatical and spelling jurisdiction. So if the African-American author writes a masterpiece, as in the case of Richard Wright's Native Son, for example, it is the language of the enemy, the treasure of the enemy that is enriched, be it with hatred and love at the same time. So there is only one, and now I quote Genet again, so there is only one solution, to accept this language but to corrupt it so skillfully that white people will get caught up in it. Accept it in its wealth, further increase its wealth, and bring within it all the hauntings and all the hatred of the white. It's a job, end of quote. But Genet also calls for the creation of another language. I quote, "I think time has come to use a new vocabulary and a syntax capable of making everybody aware of the double fight, poetic and revolutionary," end of quote. Richard Wright is more self-assured and convinced he is inventing a new, more embodied language. I quote, "And then, while writing, a new and thrilling relationship would spring up under the drive of emotion, coalescing and telescoping alien facts into a known and felt truth. That was the deep fun of the job, to feel within my body that I was pushing out on new areas of feeling, strange landmarks of emotion, cramping upon foreign soul, compounding new relationships of perceptions, making new and unheard of and unfelt effects with world. It had a buoying and tonic impact on me. My senses would strain and seek for more and more of such relationships. My temperature would rise as I worked. That is writing as I feel. It is a kind of significant living." End of quote. In his essay on the color curtain, Yoshinobu Hakutani argues that Richard Wright went to great pains to write an unprecedented postmodern, post-colonial travelogue. Maybe this premise is fulfilled by Un Captif Amoureux, Genet's last manuscript, which is neither a book about the Palestinian Revolution nor about the Black Panthers, but instead it continuously writes through the experience of being limited, both in support of people in struggle from the outside and within the means of writing itself. The book brilliantly unfolds the displacement of memory through writing. It is a memoir, a travelogue, a history book of the Black Panther movement and of the Palestinian Revolution, a journal, both a love declaration and a political pamphlet in 430 pages, a writing in search of a loved one, a writing in revolt, but also writing in struggle with the means of writing itself. Genet's writings in Un Captif Amoureux are not a distance report from the struggling ground. Genet's writing in revolt can be defined as a performance of complicity, indicating an arrival of a people's struggle within the means of writing itself. I want to show you last thing. This is another Bukhra Khalili work. Genet, as you all know, was an orphan and raised in an orphanage and escaped many times, was imprisoned, afterwards in his youth for thievery, for many different petty crimes, but his only little education he had was as a typographer, which is interesting, also in his later relationship to Black Panthers and working with the magazines of the Black Panthers. And Bukhra Khalili made this short film in which she kind of like reenacts the typographical setting of one of the last sentences Genet wrote in Un Captif Amoureux. Put all the image on language in a place of safety and make use of them, for they are in the desert, and it's in the desert we must go and look for them. I want to conclude, and I skip a bit because I want to end with a picture that Vera already showed, and in this whole idea of inventing a new language, a new literature, a new way of writing, I want to end with a quote by Richard Wright that accompanies, I think, this image in an interesting way. In this new literature, one enters a universe of menacing shadows where disparate images coalesce, while white turning into black, the dead coming to life, the top becoming the bottom, until you think you are seeing biblical beasts with 7 heads and 10 horns rising out of the sea. Imperialism turns out to have been much more morally foul than even Marx and Lenin imagined. Thank you very much.